and this message is received by the receiver. He understands the message and act upon this message. Okay, if we talk about businesses, of course, communication is one of the main factors that will help the business to succeed. Of course, building up an effective team, helping in managing employees, less errors and mistakes, all these are the advantages of having communication within the business. Okay, effective communication can be illustrated here. So a sender or a transmitter will send a message. This message will be transferred to a receiver. So the receiver will receive this message, understand this message, and give the feedback. This is the effective communication. All these should be present to have an effective communication. So the communication might not be effective if there is a problem with one of these. For example, the message sent by the sender is not clear. So here we have a problem. The receiver will not understand. There is no feedback. Let's say there is no feedback from the receiver. So this is not effective communication. So it's like a cycle. For the communication to be effective, we should have a sender, we should have a message which is clear, a way of sending a message, a receiver to receive the message and understand it, and of course a feedback. Of course, when I say ways of sending a message, I have a lot of ways. As you can see, all these are ways of sending a message. It might be a poster, for example, a sign like no smoking sign. This is a way of sending a message. So it's not only about an email or sending a letter. It can be a sign as well. In communication, we have two types of communication. The one-way communication, where the message is sent to a receiver, and this message is or requires no feedback from the receiver. So the receiver has no chance to give a feedback. So it's one way from the sender to the receiver. The two-way communication, when we have a communication between two. So the message is sent from the sender to a receiver, and this receiver is providing response or providing feedback. So as you notice in the two-way communication, the advantage that the sender will know whether the person is receiving and understanding the message, and both the sender and the receiver will be of course involved in this communication process. So the receiver might be motivated. A simple example here, a sender is telling the receiver to take the goods to the customer. So the receiver might ask a question to clarify, let's say, which customer. So here we have a two-way communication involving a feedback from a receiver. Okay, so this is the confirmation. Now, when it comes to communication, we have an internal communication. Internal communication, which is communication within the business. It's clear between the workers. And external communication, communication with other organizations and individuals outside the business. Remember, the communication outside the business might be with the government, with suppliers, with the customers, with the bank, with for example, maybe investors, and many, many more. Why it's important to have a good external communication? Because the internal communication problem could be solved between the workers. However, if there is a mistake in external communication, this sometimes might be hard to solve or might be hard to fix. That's why external communication has to go well. Now, how to choose the appropriate communication method? It depends. We have a lot of factors actually that we have to consider before choosing which method to use. So we have to know the speed, the cost. Maybe the cost should be low. The details, do we have plans? Do we have figures? The leadership style, and the receiver, for example, is near my office, or I'm sending a message to hundreds of workers. Is our letter or is the message important? Do I need to keep evidence? Do I need to get a feedback, and so on? So for example, if I want to communicate with my workers and I am a manager and I have 100 workers, so I have to ask myself, let's say, is using a letter might be suitable, or sending an email might be suitable, or for example, using a verbal ways of communication might be suitable. So I have to see a lot of factors before I consider the appropriate method to communicate. Okay, if I'm communicating with my colleague, let's say, near my office, it will be totally different from communicating with someone who is far away, for example, and so on. Okay, now communication media, we have verbal communication or oral communication, which is one-to-one communication. It could be using telephone calls or video conferencing, for example, Skype. This is called oral communication. We have a written communication. All these are written communication using reports, using letters, using faxes, text messages, Facebook nowadays, Twitter. All these are ways of communication, of course, and they are written ways of communication. We have visual communication. Visual communication using signs and diagrams and the graphs like these. These are called visual communication. Now, when it comes to verbal communication, it's clear that the advantages are clear. Actually, they are quick. It's of course efficient. You can get an immediate feedback from the receiver. You can see the body language because it's usually face to face. However, using oral communication in big meetings might be a disadvantage because not everyone will be listening or understanding your message. There is no written feedback, for example, and there is no record. This is important because if you communicate with someone orally, you don't have a record of what was said. So in a letter or in an email, let's say, you have a record or you have an evidence. Well, written communication, the advantage that you have an evidence, as we said, so disagreements will be reduced, like having a contract, for example, between the worker and the manager. It's of course it's not oral way of communication, it's written. It can record essential information. Of course, legally it's used and so on. The disadvantage of using a written way of communication, there is no direct feedback, as if you are sending a letter or an email or a text message to someone. Sometimes it's time consuming. Sometimes it's hard for people to understand it. Maybe it's language, it's English is really hard, it's too long, it's confusing, and so on. All these are disadvantages of using the written way. Visual way of communication, it's clear. If you look at these figures, they are appealing, they are attractive, they make ideas clear, like more interesting. However, the disadvantage of using these, there is no feedback, and sometimes some people won't understand the figure, let's say a graph. So not everyone understands the graph or the meaning of the graph. Okay, so we have three types. Now, which communication method is appropriate? It depends. It depends on several things. So here, if we do this exercise together, you can see here a lot of points. We'll read them together. So here, there should be no smoking in the canteen. So which one do you think is better? So I think putting a no smoking sign in the canteen will be appropriate, right? So if the management wants to instruct all employees on how the new computer system works, this should be in a written way of communication because, let's say, workers should have a paper or, let's say, a document to refer back to. See, the communication method which communication method is appropriate, it depends on what I'm doing here. If I'm talking to my employees, for example, if I am a finance manager, I want to remind the production manager that they have arranged a meeting for next week. Maybe sending an email will help. Maybe setting a meeting with him. So it depends on the situation. So we have a lot of examples, of course, in communication and choosing the best communication method. So more examples are here. So office manager, he wants to get views from the office workers. They can set a meeting. For example, a human resources manager wants to invite an applicant for a job interview. I can use oral way of communication because it's fast, or I can send an email and so on. Now, we come to the barriers, the last point. When I say barriers, are what are the, let's say, obstacles that will affect the communication or make this communication not effective? They are very easy and clear. So the barrier might be with the sender. So maybe the sender is using a very difficult language. This is a barrier. So we can overcome this by using understandable language. Maybe he's speaking too quickly. So it's clear that he can fix this by asking people for their feedback. Maybe the message is wrong, or I'm sending it to wrong receiver. This is of course a barrier of communication. Maybe it's too long. I have to make briefing and set main points. The problem might be in the medium of communication, the way of communication. So remember, the way or the channel might be wrong. So you have to choose the best channel, as I said before, in order to make the receiver understand the message and act upon your message. The problem could be in the medium, as I said. As you notice, there is no feedback, for example, received, so you have to ask for the feedback. You have to use the most useful medium in order to receive the appropriate feedback. Okay, a lot of examples here. The message or the problem might be with the receiver. He might not be listening to you, or he doesn't trust you, let's say, or the receiver is unwilling to listen to the sender. So this might make the communication also not effective. There is no feedback. There is no feedback. Of course, you have to make sure that the receiver receives your message and he understands your message and he's giving a feedback. So giving a feedback will be by acting. For example, if I tell the someone close the door, so if he receives my message and he closes the door, then this message is received and he gave me the feedback by closing the door. This is a very simple example. So sometimes no feedback is or makes the communication ineffective. Okay, so that's it for chapter 9. As you can see, chapter 9 is very easy. It's common sense. Questions in past papers usually ask about the ways of communication. We all know the ways of communication and advantages and disadvantages. So you can just read this PowerPoint, or you can watch this video. You'll see you have to study advantages and disadvantages of each type. In your book, you can see details about ways of communication and what are the advantages of using them and what are the disadvantages of using them, let's say emails or letters or whatever. So that's it for chapter 9. Two sections covered till now, section 1 and section 2. Next time, hopefully, we'll start with chapter 10, marketing section, the heaviest section in your book. Almost a lot of questions in past papers, they usually come from section 3, marketing section. Okay, so thank you for listening, and see you in section 3.